Welcome to Towle Talks. Today we get classy with PHP. So at first glance, PHP does not seem the best candidate for object-oriented coding or OOC coding. When you think about it, a lot of times we're calling a script on the server is running through it, setting up the script, running the script, and sending the output back to the user, and then it's basically tearing down that program. So it's not, if first glance you think, well, objects may be a little bit over the top. However, if you think about this, and hopefully you're noticing it when you're doing your own projects, there is a lot of looseness with PHP. There's a lot of things you can do with PHP that are not necessarily good coding practice. And so this is going to hurt you on the maintainability and scalability of your web applications. So requirements. Make sure you understand the PHP syntax up until this point, and then also make sure you understand functions and variables, especially functions. So remember, PHP is great on writability. It's very quick on writability, probably the only thing out there at the moment, excluding some of the IDE tools you can use that help you, that beats PHP in writability is probably Python. So here, that part of it's great, but with such easiness to write the code and such looseness on the syntax and the form of the language, you lose maintainability and you lose readability. It becomes, you can have spaghetti code really quick in PHP. So classes. We want to use classes and objects in our code because of the following. They provide great modularity. They help improve the maintainability in our code, and they give us potential to use other software engineering techniques and practices that can help improve our code. Alright, classes. So, I've broken this up into 3 sections. If we look at the code, I have 3 different PHP sections here, just inside a normal little HTML document. And this will deal with normal classes, this will deal with static, and this will deal with inheritance. So normal classes, the first thing to know is classes, everything inside here will be within the class scope. So I can't access any of these variables directly without accessing first either an instance of the object or this class in a static sense. So I can't just go out here and say print guest number and expect this to work. Which, if you've had any background in OOC, that should make complete sense. Now here, I'm going to have a class. This is how I declare class in PHP, and in the class name, random number game. And I have open, close, curly brackets defining my class. Of course, in class you have the typical member variables, and then the constructor, and then you have the member methods or functions. So here, we're going to deal with public and private and protected just like we would in, say, Java. So I have public guest number, public did win, and private actual number. Thinking about it, I should probably have had did win to be private because I don't want this being set externally, but it's just a demo. So here, function, if I need a constructor, I'm going to do function __ construct. That's the keyword for constructor. Now, unlike a lot of languages, I can't override this with different parameters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide the parameter, which is the number I want to guess, and then give it a default value. So if I do not give a default value when I create this object, then it's going to be 1. The guess number is going to be 1. I assign my guess number, my actual number, to a random number, and then I assign did win to equal the function display. Notice if I want to access and store a value in my class member variable, I have to use this arrow. So it's this arrow guess number equals G, or $G. This arrow actual number equals a random number. This arrow did win equals this arrow play. So it's kind of like Python in the sense that I need to use self dot in Python. I have to use this arrow to reference a variable within the class. Otherwise, if I just do this, I'm going to have a local variable, and that's not going to be what I'm trying to get. Now, for functions, here's an example of a function returning something. I have function play, and if the guessed number is equal to the actual number, I return true. Otherwise, it will be false. The two other things I'm going to show you real quick. One was the toString method. Again, if I want to print my object or an instance of this object out, I need to convert it to a string, and the computer has to know how to do that. What does it mean to convert my object to a string? So here, I'm going to compose a string variable and then return that, and it'll basically print the guessed number and the actual number. Note that since this is a private variable and I don't have any get or set functions in this class, this is the only possible way to see the actual number from the outside of the class. Another interesting thing, along with the get and set functions that PHP has, is isSet. IsSet can be useful because say you have a very advanced data structure and you have a private variable inside here, say an array of objects or an array of data you're holding, and you need to see if it's set externally outside of the class. However, you can't access a private variable from outside the class. So what you can do is you can do isSet, and then it'll send in the name of the thing you're trying to set. I'll show you how to do this in a moment. And then you can check what the name is. So in this case, the name is $n. And if that variable matches something, say actual number, so my private variable is actual number. So if that's the case, then I'm going to return isSet this actual number. I can access actual number here because I'm inside my class. Otherwise, if it's anything else I'm sending in, I'm just going to return false because I don't have any other private variables. Again, all I'm doing is allowing the outside to determine whether or not a private variable in my class has been set or not. This does not actually affect the class itself. So if I say isSet on this class, it will return true because the memory has been allocated for this class. So here, after I have these functions, and it'll make more sense when we use them, now we have to make the class. Remember, the class itself is more of a blueprint, and until I call the constructor, I allocate the memory and I construct or make an object. This is not that useful. So here it's going to be my game equals new random number game. I'm passing in 3. So 3 is going to call the constructor, and G is going to equal 3, and my guess number will then be 3. I want to see, well, first I'm going to do it wrong. I'm going to say isSet my game arrow BDB or whatever, some junk variable that doesn't actually exist. So it's going to assume that this is private. It's going to end up calling this function, but because it's not going to equal actual number, it's just going to return false. So here, say isSet return true will not be printed in this particular case. I'll show you the opposite case in a moment. Here we have my game guessed, and then I give the I guess this should be my guess. It's not the game's guessed. My guess. I think that's how I spell that. Yeah. My guess, and then the my game guessed number. So this is public. This is fine. I can access it just like, instead of using a dot, I'm going to use an arrow. Everything in PHP is an arrow. So my game arrow guess number, because guess number is public. Here, and then it also did win is public. So my game did win. If that's true, or arrow did win, there's echo I won, else I didn't win. And then if I want to print this statement out, I can do echo my game toString is, and then my game. So when I do this, this instance of the game, this instance of random number game is going to say, okay, convert my object into a string. How do I convert my object into a string? I call toString, and then whatever is returned from that will be the string that represents my object. So let's not open anything. Let's save this. We'll open up the Firefox, refresh it. Now, so the name is BDB. Where is this coming from? This is coming from, let me split screen it here. This is coming from my isSet function. So the name is BDB, and since it's not equal to actual number, it's going to return false. So notice it does not print isSet return true. It prints my guess is my guess 3, and I didn't win. Then after this, I print this line here, the number you guessed, and then the actual number. So the number you guessed is 3, the actual number is 7. So this, again, this is the only way to get the actual number because it's private. I could make a get function and I could do it that way too, but just for now, that's how I'm going to show you guys how to do it. So that is classes in a basic sense. Now, real quick, let me show you what happens if I do the right thing. So instead of some junk variable, I'm going to pass in my game arrow actual number. So I want to make sure that this number exists. It is set, and I'll save it, refresh it. It says is set return true because and the name is actual number. So since the name was correct, I'm going to return that is set this value, and of course this value is going to be set because it was set in the constructor. So now that we have the class, the next thing we have to think about is the static variables and when and where to use them. So PHP admittedly does not have a super high use of static variables unless you are storing an instance of a class on a session variable, because more than likely these programs are just going to keep being reset every time you call them. However, there are certain cases where static is useful, and this is more in the case of functions or methods in your class. Maybe I don't need an object entity so much as I just have 6 or 10 helper functions, and I want to put them, encapsulate them into a single entity. That is where the static functions or the static variable will help you. Static variables can only be accessed from a class call, so it cannot be accessed from a non-static context. Static functions can be accessed by both a class and an object of that class. Static functions are useful for encapsulating various helper functions together into one entity. Alright, now static. Static variables can be a little more useful, or static classes, or I shouldn't say classes, static elements in classes can be a little more useful in PHP because oftentimes you want a collection of elements, so or a collection of functions. Collection of functions. So here is an example of class my helper. I'm going to have basically one static variable and one static function. The static function will draw a number of smiley faces to the screen to whatever I set in. And notice the default is 1. So nothing really exciting here. Imagine if you had a web application where you needed 15 or 16 different helper functions. Maybe one was some sort of encoding, decoding. Maybe you needed to calculate some values. And you just kept using these things everywhere, and you needed access to them. Therefore, here this would be a perfect example of where to use a static variable, static function, pardon me. The static variables are not quite as useful, and I'll show you why in a moment. So remember, static means I don't have to instantiate, I don't have to make a class. They apply to all elements of the class themselves. So any instance of the class can invoke a static function. In PHP, a non-static or an instance of a class cannot invoke a static variable. That's one big difference between PHP and Java, and I'll show you that in a moment. So here, if I have a static variable, I can reference it from my class. So I'm just going to say my class name, instead of making an instance like I did up here, said my game equals new random number game, I'm going to just use a class name and then the namespace operator, so : and $n, and that will reference this static variable. Then I can simply set it to a value. Then I can echo my static variable is, and then dot my helper : n. So this is how I use static variables. They are not as useful because I can't use them in a non-static sense. So if I try to, like down here when I made a new helper, if I try to do this, so if I try to access this from an instance of this class, it's going to give me an error. This means I cannot actually access the static variables from an instance of a class, which is not that useful. So you see that a lot of times static variables will not be used. However, I can, if I need to, access the function or the method from a static or non-static context. So here I'm using the same instance, so this will not work, but this will work. So I can call the function. And again, like I was saying, it's nice that I can have a set of functions, maybe for encryption, decryption, whatever I need from my web application I need to grab. I can grab them and I can reuse them. So having a static or a set of static functions in a class just for a helper class can be very useful. So I go over here, I refresh this. You'll see that the static variable name is Todd. So here I set the static variable name, then I echoed it out. Then I said, and I called draw smile from using the static context. So I'm just calling the class, say class namespace use draw smile. So I draw smile 10 times, c equals 10, and I run this thing 10 times. And then prints out 10 smiley faces. Then from the non-static syntax, I call draw smile without anything, so the default value is 1. So I print 1 smiley face from the non-static call. So that's basically static. Quick and dirty intro to static variables. Now, another thing that's not entirely intuitive to think, if you think about, is the inheritance. Again, PHP at first glance does not seem like that's really a high priority. However, inheritance is going to give you the scalability, the maintainability, the readability, and the reusability of your code at a far, far greater amount than any other coding practice. In fact, in the next lecture, or maybe 2 lectures from now, when we actually start CodeIgniter, you're going to see the first thing they do is you inherit from this class. So let's talk about inheritance a little bit, and then that should wrap it up for the PHP classes. Inheritance. Inheritance provides you the following. Scalability. So remember, your project will grow. You might think you're done, you might think it's finished, but you'll be surprised how much will be added at the end. You need to have inheritance in order to allow scalability for your project. Maintainability. It's going to be much easier to debug, mainly because you're reusing your code, which is the third option. You're reusing your code. You don't have to copy and paste different functions, different classes. So if there is a bug, you can fix it in one place. Now, finally, our third case, we are going to use inheritance. So we're talking about inheritance real quick. We will be using inheritance in this class. We will not be doing a lot of our own inheritance. So here I'm going to show you a couple things that are a little bit different in PHP than other classes. So here I have a base class. I have a public X, protected Y, and private Z variables. And then I have the constructor, X equals 10, Y equals 10, Z equals 10, and I echo inside the parent class constructor. By the way, here's another one of those special functions. This is a deconstructor. All I'm doing is showing you that, whether or not I'm inside the deconstructor. Then I have a child class, and I say extends base class. This is how I inherit from base class. And then I'm going to use public function construct again inside child constructor. We'll get back to this line in a moment. And then here I'm going to echo X, Y, and then I'll try to echo Z, and you'll see that I can't do that. Then I'm going to set X, Y, and Z, And this actually will work, but that's because it's going to just make a new variable z in this class. And then I'm going to try it, and I'll print these out, and then it will work. So then I can print all three of these out. The reason I can't print z first is because up here z is a private variable. When I declare this z equals 100 down here, it will actually make a new private variable and overload it for this class. Then in the deconstructor, I'm just going to print inside child's deconstructor. So first of all, let's look at what happens when I run this with just like it is. So I save it. I haven't changed anything yet, so we'll run this just like it is. It says inside child's constructor, then I print x and y, but x and y are blank, so there's nothing here. And then I'm going to print initialize the variables x, y, and z, so then I print x, y, and z, and I get the 250, 100, which I'd expect. And then I say inside the child's deconstructor. So when the page finishes loading, it's going to deconstruct the object. There's one thing, having a super large scale class hierarchy is not as useful in web application because you have to build up and tear down this class structure every time you invoke the web page. So a couple odd things. One, why didn't this print? Well, PHP does not by default invoke the parent constructor or deconstructor. So if I want to invoke the parent constructor and deconstructor, which I normally do, I kind of get PHP's philosophy on this, but I actually believe that it's better normally to call the constructor first and then do the child constructor, because this can initialize things for the child constructor and you can reuse your code. So parent namespace __ construct will invoke this constructor, and this will set up your variables x, y, and z. However, you cannot use z even though I've called this, and then this will just call the parent's deconstructor, which should print out inside the parent's class. So let's save this, and then we'll see what happens at this point when I try to print these two variables. So I save that. Nope, that's not what I want. I refresh. So now I see 10 and 10. First I see inside child constructor, inside parent constructor. So I know I jumped up here, initialized it. Then I printed 10 and 10 out for x and y because that's from the parent. So I initialize my three variables and then print them out. Then I say inside the parent class deconstructor because I called the parent deconstructor first. Then I see the inside the child deconstructor. However, so this is more of what you would expect, say you were coming from a Java perspective. Now, still, this will not work, but we'll just test it out. We'll say, what about if I just do that? So we'll print out z. I've already initialized it, so this should work. So go ahead and try initialize this. I run this, and I'm going to see I get an error, and the error is I did something wrong here. Hold on. Oh, oops. There. I refresh this. So notice undefined property, child class z, and the reason it's undefined is this class here cannot see the private variable up here. So generally speaking, when you're using inheritance, you're going to make it all protected or public, and most likely protected. Again, we're not going to be spending too much time in this class setting up the base class or the class structure, but we are almost all of our classes, with the exception of views, later on in the MVC architecture, models and controllers are going to be inheriting from CodeIgniter's model and controller class. So it's important that we understand a little bit about PHP inheritance. So for review, we've talked about basic PHP classes, static variables and static functions, and basic class inheritance. Here is the problem of the day. Please pause the video and work through this. It should be fairly simple, but I want you guys to have some hands-on experience with the classes. This has been Towle Talks. Thank you for watching. Please make sure you understand this, because even if you don't use all of these tools in PHP, you will be expected as a computer scientist to understand inheritance and classes and object-oriented coding. So again, this is a useful lecture, even if you don't use it directly, just for review and ensuring that you have this concept. Again, thank you for watching, and until next time, cheers. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you learned something and enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a comment or a like below. And again, thank you.